Good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon's webinar. My name is Antonio Vecchio and I'm the Community and Consumer Engagement Manager at the Spinal Research Institute. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands and pay respects to elders past, present and future. Just some housekeeping before we go on as well, that being a live webinar and being online, there is technical support if you need. If you look down the bottom of your screen, there is a chat button there, and feel free to, if you have any issues, engage with live support. So as I said, welcome to this webinar. This is part 4 of our 4-part series where we talk about consumer engagement in research. In the first parts, we discussed the research process as well as consumer involvement. And in the last webinar, we spoke to some active researchers. Feel free to go to our website to view the recordings of those that have been made available there. In this webinar, I talk with Leanne Rees, and Leanne is a PhD student who is also a physiotherapist at the Victorian Spinal Cord Service. In 2018, she completed a Masters of Public Health in which she fostered interest in social and environmental determinants of health and well-being for people with SCI. In 2019, Leanne commenced a PhD investigating media portrayal of SCI and the impact. In today's webinar, Leanne will discuss how she involved consumers in her research, and we'll discuss that throughout the presentation. So I'd like to introduce Leanne. Feel free to, at any stage, ask questions in the chat and we'll do our best to address them towards the end of the session. Welcome, Leanne.
Thanks, Antonio, and thank you so much for the invitation to present today. Yes, I said that I'll be presenting. Oh, sorry, have I shared my screen?
No, we'll share that now, so I'll hand over to you.
Oh, great. Excellent. New platforms, you think by now. So my PhD, you think I'd be very proficient at webinars, given most of it's been during COVID, but I think there'll always be little hurdles along the way. But thank you so much for the invitation to present the consumer engagement experience of my doctoral research. So Antonio, along with the webinars that you've presented, it's been fantastic hearing about really advocating for engagement of consumers in research. And I guess for me, coming into my PhD, it was really important that I always centred people with spinal cord injury at the centre. And as we know with the literature, it says and confirms that with consumer engagement, it can add value to health and disability research by improving its quality, making sure that the research is going to be applicable, and that the outcomes can be transferred a little bit more easily to the community. Studies have also shown that engaging with people with spinal cord injury can facilitate greater purpose in the research and help make it more efficient. It can help translate the findings of the research and new knowledge out into the community of people with spinal cord injury, and helping get those research outcomes to people with spinal cord injury a little bit more easily. People with spinal cord injury are increasingly being consulted on what kind of research should happen, but are less likely to actually be engaged in the research process itself. So hence why I thought, well, let's do this and see how we go. And so what I was thinking about what I'd present today is kind of a reflection of what I've done 3 years later. When I started my PhD, I really didn't know what the consumer engagement process was going to look like. And it's only that I've been able to reflect back and look that I've actually, for myself, managed to make sense of what happened. Part of this was actually coming up with a framework to figure out, well, what is consumer engagement and how do you measure it, or how do you can figure out what are the outcomes? I think it was in 2016 or 17 that the ISCOS conference was in Sydney, and I sat in on a workshop that spoke about consumer engagement and research. And this research cycle was presented by Burwood and Praxis in Canada. And it's always resonated with me because I think it was the first time that I thought, oh, okay, these are all the steps of research, and this is how you can engage with consumers. This was before I had any inkling that I would do a PhD. So, I didn't know how I'd still be using this a few years later. But the research cycle is really important, not only in the PhD setting, but for any kind of research that's happening out there. So this becomes framework number one that I reflected on when I was thinking about how it was that I engaged with consumers for my research. The second thing I considered that I acknowledged was that you can have different levels of consumer participation. This is a framework from the IAP2. Now, I did have to write down what IAP2 stood for again because I always forget that acronym, the International Association for Public Participation. And they acknowledge that you can have different levels of consumer participation. People might be familiar, the Cancer Council of Australia have adapted a framework similar to this. I think it's pretty much word for word, but I do know that that empower level, so the one that has the most, the highest level of participation, I think they call that consumer-led, and the NHRMC have modelled theirs off the Cancer Council. But if you take it back a few steps, it all starts here at the IAP2 and the spectrum of public participation. And I guess I didn't realise that there was I acknowledged that consumers can participate at different levels, but I didn't realise there was a framework for it. So this really helped me figure out what it was that I was doing as well. But I guess what I found challenging along the way was, how does this all fit in the context of a PhD? And there's all types of research that's out there. You'll have research projects that might be funded just for a 6 month, might be a 6 month project. You might have a research project that's adjacent to a much bigger project that might be funded, say, for example, through the NHRMC. For people who are overseas listening to that, that's an Australian grant process offered by the government. Or it might be a PhD. So I think it's really important to think about, well, what's the context of your research? As a PhD student, you're responsible for providing an independent body of work. You may have limited agency or control over the research topic. Now, that wasn't the case for me. I was fortunate to get a government grant that I could lead my own research. But some PhD students, their project's embedded in a much larger project. So that changes the context of their research. I think it's really important to think about time. So a full-time PhD, you have 3.5 years, which seems a long time at the beginning, but by the end it's gone really fast. But as I said before, some research grants may only go for 6 months. So you really got to think about, well, what's the context of your research in terms of time. Funds are important as well. I'm going to talk about a little bit more of that later. And I think it's also appreciating, well, what's the skill set here? When I started my PhD, although I've been working as a physiotherapist in spinal cord injury for a long time, I had no prior consumer engagement experience, specifically in research. And I was an apprentice researcher. I was very much learning that process as well. So there's a lot going on. And I think that needs to be recognised, because you are learning skills, and it's how you can embed that consumer engagement realistically within these the contextual factors that are shaping what it is that you're up to. But core to all of this, at the end of the day, is that you want to have meaningful engagement. And that means really valuing and listening to the lived experience. During the past 3 years, these guiding the integrated knowledge translation guidelines came out of Canada, and this provided a really great framework to make sure that what it was that I was doing was actually going to have meaning. The IAP2 also have some core values, and they're all very, very similar. These ones have been designed specifically for spinal cord injury. So then I was reflecting back and thinking, well, you've got your research cycle, you've got all the different levels of consumer engagement that can happen at any point of that research cycle. And this all sits in the context of your research. And then core to any of the activity that you're doing, you want to make sure that you're adhering to the guiding principles. So this is a framework I wish I'd seen 3 years ago that really helped put into context what it was that I was doing. As I said, you have your research cycle, and you can acknowledge you can have different levels of consumer engagement at each stage of that research cycle. This all sits in the box in the context of your research, but centre to it all is making sure that you're adhering to guiding principles that are respecting and listening to the voice of the lived experience. So as I said, I wish I'd known this about 3 years ago, but it's now that I'm reflecting back and making a little bit more sense of what it is that I did. So I'm hoping now that this can help other PhD students along the way when they want to be starting with consumer engagement. They can kind of look at it in this framework. But then how do you prove it, or how do you report it? As of what I've learned as researchers, it's all about, well, can you prove that happened? And, what was the outcome when you did this? And to be honest, this was a real challenge along the way as well, because I just didn't know how I would evaluate the consumer engagement experience. In my mind, I thought an evaluation would mean that you had some really hardcore quantitative data that tells you, well, I did this and then this happened and this is how I measured it and this was the outcome. And it was just almost near impossible to do from my perspective with the consumer engagement experience. And so when it got to the tail end and I wanted to be able to offer some form of an evaluation, I ended up falling upon the GRIP 2, which is a guideline for reporting of I can't remember what the I stands for, International Guidance of Reporting Public and Patient Participation. And I actually did see this document about a couple of years ago, and I found it a little bit overwhelming, but I guess now I can put it into context and see what it had to offer. And it provides a framework for reporting, basically, so you can describe what it was that happened. So the evaluation wasn't necessarily proving that consumer engagement was beneficial. It was more that describing the process. And I think once I kind of made that separation, it was a lot easier for me to offer to approach the evaluation the way that I did. So does that make sense, Antonio? Oh, I can't hear you.
Sorry. Yeah, it really does.
Okay.
And I think just some ideas from there. You mentioned some resources and framework, and you developed your own. In developing your framework around engaging consumers, I guess what were the key principles that stood out to you?
I think it was being comfortable with the fact that you can have different levels of consumer engagement at each stage of the research cycle. And I probably felt that at the beginning I had the unrealistic expectation that I would have greater involvement. But I guess when I came to realise or feel comfortable with what my skills were, but then also recognising what the skill set was of the consumers in the group, I felt that was a bit of a light bulb moment when, it's okay, because you can have these various levels, but then also piecing in together those guiding principles, which I think are the most important. You could engage with consumers to come up with a research question and help with your study design. But if you're not adhering to those guiding principles, then is it really meaningful? And so to me, that's the important part.
So you cited some resources in your presentation there. What other resources did you find were beneficial in going through this process and involving consumers?
Reading other people's papers who did something similar. And to be honest, again, to help myself feel a little bit better, it's only really in the past couple of years that there's been some published papers where people have done an evaluation of their consumer engagement. But I think when I saw how it was that they reported it, it helped me to figure out how it was that I'm going to report mine. So yeah, that was a huge help.
And what helped you piece all this together then?
Hindsight. It took a lot of work, to be honest, and obviously with the help of my supervisors in kind of constructing it. As I said, at the beginning of the PhD, I was an apprentice researcher and I didn't have any skills in consumer engagement, even though I've got two supervisors, one of whom does have experience. But as people who have done a PhD or embarking on one, very much a lot of it is self-learning. And so even with some good guidance, I was still trying to navigate how it comes together. And I think just with time and reflecting on what feels is a good fit.